All right. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to um, move into a discussion of utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist approach to ethics, and it is our other sort of modern approach to sort of compare contrast with the Kantian deontological approach to ethics. And so, recall deontology begins from a very rule-based view, and it grounds itself in reason and says that we must sort of perform actions which are sort of appropriately sort of sort of dutiful, right? That we appeal to our sense of duty or to duty itself, and we the actions that we take have their worth based completely in our duty just to do the right thing, right? That it's not for some end, it's not for some consequences that I'm after, right? But it's the duty itself that matters. And so the consequentialist approach rather is going to say, no, the way we evaluate a particular action is rather through the consequences, the results of that action, right? Do the results provide us, right? Does the action provide us with a good beneficial outcome, right? When I sort of do some action, the way we evaluate whether or not that was a good action is what it produces, right? What it provides, and so we're going to move to this consequentialist view, and these are obviously are very very different, and in many ways, right, kind of the opposite approaches to ethics. However, they are both grounded in the kind of modern approach of we need a practical application of a principle to particular sort of questions and problems that we run up against in our lives, right? That we're sort of confronted, we're faced with sort of moral questions all the time, and in order to sort of work through those, right, what we need to do is we need to be able to kind of respond with some practical tool. So what we're going to do today is we are going to kind of work our way through Mill's thought, kind of in the same way that we did through Kant's thought. But we'll start with the kind of the basic moral principles, right? The basic philosophical principles that ground his theory. And then we'll move into sort of a discussion of the theory and then look at potential objections to it. Most of these objections are things that Mill himself raised, right? He anticipated a number of problems that people might have with utilitarianism, and he kind of spent his time trying to deal with those. So let's go ahead and share the screen, and then we'll get into some of those questions, hopefully. All right. So just to kind of highlight who we have here, right? The sort of founding figures in utilitarianism. So first of all, we have Jeremy Bentham. You can see his date, 1748 to 1832. And he developed the theory of utilitarianism as a way to think largely about political economic thoughts, but he certainly considered it to be kind of worthwhile to think about it in terms of ethics, morality, as well. And he was close with the Mills, particularly with James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, who was also a utilitarian. And James Mill is best known for his work in economics. And then we have John Stuart Mill, who who tried to develop a theory that would be in utilitarianism that would be particularly useful um, for kind of everyday ethical questions, right? So he wanted to make this sort of a personal philosophy, right? So not just helpful for kind of big, sort of political questions, right? How do we, what's sort of the best policy that will produce the best outcome, the best consequences, right? But he wanted to think about how I can live my life, right, and you can live your life in a way that is considering these sort of consequences, and so. John Stuart Mill himself was very kind of engaged in the world. He was an activist in a number of causes. He was a member of parliament for a term and advocated a number of policies that are very consistent with utilitarianism. In particular, he spent a lot of time on kind of animal rights questions, and he also dealt with questions around sort of uh, the role of women in society and advocated for the equality of women politically, and so he considered these questions in a practical as well as political arena as well. Now, John Stuart Mill, in sort of dealing with the problem of ethics, begins with this question around what we call meta ethics, right? And meta ethics is looking at the basic assumptions of ethics, right? In particular, John Stuart Mill was concerned with this idea of the good. So he says that if you look at the history of philosophy is filled with philosophers trying to answer the question of what the good is. These are all reasonable philosophers, people who have very sophisticated arguments, have thought a lot about this, and they continue, right, to run up against the same problem over and over and over again, right? And what is that problem? Well, that they come up with some theory, and then someone else comes up with a contrary theory. Not that they are sort of progressing in ongoing sort of research around the question of the good, right? But there's this sort of back and forth, and kind of inability to settle on kind of basic principles around the question of what the good is. And so his conclusion from all this is that, like, this enterprise, this project of trying to define the good with sort of certain deductive logic, right, is sort of faulty. There's really some echoes here from Aristotle. I think that Aristotle kind of had a similar intuition that what we need to be concerned with is like how it is that humans live their lives. So what does he do about this, right? And what he says is that we just need to look to kind of our human nature. And he says that we as humans tend to operate in this teleological way, right? And he's not saying that there's a kind of basic purpose to the universe, or that we even have a particular purpose, but that we as human beings operate teleologically, right? That we have purposes, we posit them, we have goals, we have ends that we are after, and then we have these ways of kind of getting there, right? And then we evaluate those ways, those rules, those things that we do to try to get us to those ends. We evaluate those according to whatever that end is, right? Like, so this is kind of like the hypothetical imperatives for Kant, right? That we operate according to these hypothetical imperatives, and so we then look at the rules, the ways to get there, as a sort of according to, right? We judge them according to the end, right? Are they the best way to get us to that end, or are there other ways to do so, right? And so he begins from this sort of teleological place, saying like, okay, what is it that humans tend to want, right? What is their goal in life, right? What are they after? And what he says about this is like, whatever this is, right? It cannot be proven in the way that like a mathematical proof can be done, right? Or some sort of kind of deductive um, conclusion that we can, get to, right? Rather, right, this is the type of thing that is just not subject to direct proof, right? It's not the type of thing that we can prove in that sort of way. Um, rather, it's something that we must just assume, admit without proof, right? We have to admit whatever the good is, whatever we take to be the good is, to be good without any proof. And so, what is that good, right? And this is kind of where he moves next, is trying to define what he thinks is likely the end of our actions as human beings, what we tend to want. Um, and so for Mill, right, what is it? It's going to be happiness, right? So we have some agreement with Aristotle. We'll see how he disagrees with Aristotle in a minute, right? But some agreement with Aristotle that if you look at human beings, that we tend to be after this one thing, which is like our happiness, human happiness, right? That's what we want. As a moral principle, he says that the happiness we're concerned with is the happiness for the greatest number, um, right? And in addition, we try to avoid the reverse of happiness, right? Those things that make us unhappy. So happiness for the greatest number. So the greatest happiness principle or principle of utility is actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness for the greatest number, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And then he says, okay, well, what is happiness, right? We all tend to agree that we're after happiness, we want happiness, but really, what is it, right? In its most basic sense, like, what is happiness? And this is where the disagreement with Aristotle arises, is in the definition of happiness. For Mill, happiness is just the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. And so, of course, this places Mill very close to the Epicureans, right? Where happiness, right, what we're after as human beings, is the fulfillment of our pleasures, right? So happiness is a presence of pleasure, and I think also very consistent with the Epicureans, the absence of pain. So kind of plugging that back in to the greatest happiness principle, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote pleasure for the greatest number, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, which is pain, right? So we evaluate actions based on how much pleasure and pain they create. Why pleasure, right? So what's the purpose? Why does Mill kind of settle on pleasure? And the reason he settles on pleasure, he says, is because pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, right? If you look at human beings, the only things that they are really concerned with at the end of the day is avoiding pain and obtaining pleasure. And these can be very complicated, right? These can be sort of complex. They can be sort of deep forms of pleasure, right? They can show up in kind of all parts of the human experience and psyche, whether it's sort of physical pleasure and pain, whether it's psychological or emotional pleasure or pain, right? But at some level, it's all pleasure and pain, right? And we seek pleasure and pain for itself, or we do things which may themselves not be pleasurable, right? But and may in fact be painful, right? But we do them because they will produce a greater amount of pleasure, or they'll prevent a greater amount of pain. So, I mean, just sort of think of any sort of medical procedure, right? Like, we don't enjoy that sort of stuff, but we do it because it produces this greater benefit. So, of course, this makes Mill a hedonist in the same way that Epicureans are hedonists. And it makes him, he is both a psychological hedonist, meaning that we are in fact motivated by pleasure and avoidance of pain, but he's also an ethical hedonist, saying that we ought to be motivated for the by producing the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number, right? Okay, so that's sort of the starting point here for Mill, and he's going to begin to sort of look at ways in which people might object to this view, right? So that's where he turns, right? We get the greatest happiness principle. Our action should be such that we're trying to produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. And if we just sort of use it as an example, some of the stuff we looked at with Kant, right? So this example of you know, kind of lying to my brother about whether, you know, I like the chocolate chip cookies. What I should do there is I should sort of say, okay, if I tell the truth, what pleasure and what pain will that cause? If I lie, right, what pleasure or pain will that cause or avoid? And so I evaluate it, I weigh it out according to sort of these two options. So then he spends the rest of his time kind of looking at potential objections to this theory, right? And so kind of the first part is kind of laying the groundwork, and then he gets to these objections. And that's where he spends most of the work in his work on utilitarianism, is dealing with these objections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and then so we'll have this part of the video kind of laying the foundation, and then we'll turn to these objections and applies in the next video, and kind of fill out what utilitarianism actually looks like. So let's stop here, and we'll pick it up in just a moment.